know there are challenges for employers in the market. From market trends to interviews with industry leaders, let us be your trusted advisor as we explore the Benefit Summary, presented by Genesis Health, with your host, Matt Monahan.
Greg, thank you for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is our fifth podcast, first in this room. And so really cool space, really excited to kind of relaunch this podcast with you and get down and talk about the PBMs. Oh. And you have a very rich history in this, so I'm very excited about that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. I mean, so impactful in healthcare, and yet nobody knows anything about it.
I mean, it's so impactful that I had to write notes, like more notes than I could have possibly. I don't think I wrote this many notes in college.
Oh,
and many would contest.
Not surprising.
Yeah, no. But, with all the CEOs that I've met, everyone has a story. So, walk me through, maybe a little background, and then tell us about what it was like, why you wanted to start this company, why you started this PBM, and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So, pharmacist by training. This is like my 30th year in pharmacy. First 20 years was really independent community pharmacy. Last 10 have been more working with self-funded employers. And for a period of time, I had a role where I worked with the Walt Disney companies, Microsoft's, BMWs. And through the 8 years of doing that, continued to see how pharmacy costs were a problem and access was a problem. And both of those always went back to the PBM doing something to make that a problem.
Yep.
So we made the decision, hey, we could sit along the sidelines and continue to complain about the PBM industry, or we could do something about it. So about 3 years ago, we started looking to see what our options were. And the only real option to fix the problem was to be the problem. So we said, let's just go be our own PBM and see if we can do something right. So every decision we've made since then is to say, how do we create a PBM that's completely unconflicted and always working in our client and their members' best interests? So that's why we stood up as a public benefit corporation. So most corporations have to work in their shareholders' best interest. And that's part of the problem with healthcare is everybody's just trying to make as much money as possible. As a public benefit corporation, my role as an officer of the company and a board member is to do as much good for as many people as possible.
Yep.
And then that's the foundation that we just built off of.
And so when you say access, because I think with just pharmacy coverage in general, people I go to CVS, I get the medicines that's prescribed. Every once in a while, someone gets, turned away for something else or switched because of step therapy or some of the other things in there. But what do you mean with the access specifically in that scenario, increasing access?
Yeah, I would say it means two things to me. One, as CVS owns their own pharmacies, they don't let people in general go to Walgreens, Kroger, Walmart, these other pharmacies because they really want to control the supply chain. And then when CVS, the PBM, gets people to CVS pharmacy and gets to decide what they pay themselves, it's a huge profit center for them.
Yeah.
The second piece of that, though, is these concepts of exclusionary formularies. And it really started in 2016, I think. Express Scripts led the charge because before 2016, if you think insulin, you got Eli Lilly who makes insulin and Novo Nordisk. You had one on tier 1 and one on tier 2. So all of the PBMs kind of had general access to all products. But ESI had this great idea to say, hey, if I go to Lilly and Novo and say it's all or nothing, so you either get on formulary or you don't, well, that means those manufacturers, if they're not on formulary, they don't sell any product. So pharma was in this situation where do you want half a sandwich or no sandwich at all? So that's how the rebate started growing because in 2016, Lilly might be paying a 20% rebate if they were tier 1 and Novo might be paying 10 if they were tier 2. Well, then if you got all or nothing, then you start getting 30, 35, 40%. And as we sat here today, insulin's paying 90% rebate because it's all or nothing.
And so in that scenario where the rebates increase like that, the price inherently, the underlying price has to go up as well, right? And that's something that you're addressing through AffirmedRX, right?
That's exactly right. And we spend a lot of time, especially talking with policymakers, because everybody wants to say pharma's the bad guy. The reason drugs go up is because the manufacturers are increasing the price. Yeah. And PCMA, the trade organization that represents PBMs, says that all the time. And it's a really good half-truth. Yes, the manufacturer raised the price, but the back-end story is really the manufacturer had to increase their rebate and pay the PBM more to stay on formulary. And so as a function of that, to maintain at least some level of profitability for themselves, the price had to go up too.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because when you start looking at some of the price gouging stuff that Big Pharma got charged with, which I think is in the minority of things that are driving a cost. Like, I think the cost of bringing to market a drug is more impactful in the cost of the drug. And then, like, I think those price gouging situations where people are trying to get the profits faster.
Yes.
But, like, that was the minority of the things that are happening. The bulk of it is, like, taking something, like we talked, last night about molecule to manufacturing is a massive expense for a pharmaceutical company. And then you layer in all these other distribution mechanisms that kind of, like, layer on top of it. To me, it's mind-boggling on where we can start impacting savings and how those costs start going up. But is a driver of that just the fact that, like, we just don't know what the starting price is, right?
I think that's part of it. And I do want to say, like, pharma's not innocent, right? Like, pharma does bad things that makes prices more expensive that aren't super ethical. But to your point, that's a very small part of the problem.
Yeah.
The other thing that is, you kind of think about pharma, there's federal policies that also make pharma do what they do. Because there's a couple laws out there that say pharma, once you release your drug, if you increase the price of your drug more than, the consumer price index, the rest of that money gets, sent back to the federal government as a penalty. So if you're the executive of a pharma company and once you release your drug to market, you really can't ever raise the price, and you can bring it in at a low price or a high price, what price are you going to bring your drug out at?
Or you're stuck with the CPI increase of 1.5 to 2% a year.
Historically,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, not now.
Not now. Yeah, they're doing okay this year, but...
So speaking of legislation, you got to testify in front of Congress.
Yes.
So first, like, what was... I want to talk about the experience first, because I watched most of it, and 5 hours in that seat getting grilled intermittently by, whoever's in the room had to be super intimidating or crazy from an experience standpoint.
It was like, and it was funny from our standpoint, the witnesses, you're sitting there, and then you've got all of the congressional leaders here with the Republicans on this side and the Democrats on this side, and they take turns. So it felt like a tennis match a little bit, because you're like, yes, 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 yes. So it was back and forth the whole time, which made it interesting. But then the other odd part, we sat there the whole time and we couldn't leave. And you're watching all the senators and congressmen, and they kind of come and go, and, they're in and out the whole time, and they show up and they ask their question and they leave. But when you're a witness at one of those things and you can't leave, like, they should tell you don't drink coffee before you come in that morning, because, like, nobody warns me about that. And that would have been really good to know. So,
well, it's fascinating because, like, when you watch the news or something, you watch, like, Mark Zuckerberg sitting there and it looks like he's there for, an 8-hour testimony. It looks like he's truly in there for 8 hours. And I watched you go through this. I'm like, I don't think he's getting out of this place.
No, yeah. There was no offer for a break.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been, like, immediate Manhattan for me directly after. Like, restroom and then directly to a Manhattan.
Yes.
To make something, like, because the stress looked pretty palpable.
Well,
and you were there as a friendly witness. Like, you were there just to provide context. Correct. As an expert, right? You weren't there. They were complimentary of the work you were doing, as opposed to going in there under the guise of, like, we're investigating you, which is a different animal altogether.
But even the friendly witness, you're friendly to 70 to 80% of the people. 20 or 30% of the people are still not friendly to you. So you're going to get it somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance, too, where someone would come in and talk about what the administration's doing. And you could really tell, though, who really was drilling into the problem. Like, who wanted to get some answers to try and create a solution to this. And it was evident that the majority of that committee was really determined to try and get to a root cause. But, I mean, in your thoughts, like, after sitting through that, like, how far away are they from either regulating this or even truly understanding it?
Yeah, I think that I'll go backwards. On the truly understanding it, I think 3 years ago, if you would have gone to Washington, D.C. and talked about PBMs, people would have said, what is that?
Yeah.
I think in general, all the staffers, all the policymakers clearly know what PBMs are and have a general sense on the issues that they cause for drug affordability in America. As far as getting something done, if you had asked me last month, I would have said decent shot.
Yeah.
But now we've kind of got this dysfunction where we don't have a Speaker of the House. Legislation can't move forward. The way that legislation moves forward, it's got to go through a couple of these other committees to get approved, and those committees are super backed up. So it sounds like no legislation is going to move forward this year.
Yeah.
By the time they get into next year, it's a whole nother set of problems. So,
yeah.
I mean, I think people want to do something, but when you just consider how things get done in D.C. and the volume of stuff that's out there on a more pressing level, I would say less than average shot something gets done, in my opinion.
Yeah, which is disappointing, right? Because I think there's an area here. One of the things that they honed in on, where they picked up on, was the GPOs. 2 of the 3 being off U.S. soil. And I think that's a place where they really like this feels like something they can regulate. Like that seemed to be, part of the bellwether on like what they were talking about was these two GPOs in Ireland and Switzerland. How can we, what can we do about these? They're doing business in the United States. We can regulate them. Is that an area that they go after, you think, the overall GPOs, or is it going to be more directed towards PBMs and big pharma? Like some of it was like what the concern is they're simplifying the problem, and then where they can go after it is the other part I was kind of interested in as I listened to their questions.
Yeah, I would say I don't see them going after big pharma this year because they kind of went after big pharma last year for just lack of a better term when they passed the IRA and they allowed the federal government for the first time to negotiate prices for Medicare. So I think pharma kind of had their hit last year. So this year it's like, well, let's flip and look at the PBM industry. I think the biggest thing that's going to come out of any legislation if it hits is the delinking stuff, where they're saying we want to delink the profit a company makes from the price of the drug. So let's get out of this world where somebody says, I'm going to make 9%. So I, as a PBM, know I'm going to make a 9% profit, and there's a $5,000 drug I can approve or a $50 drug. Well, if you're a for-profit company, do you want to make 9% on $5,000 or $50? So the government say that's part of the reason why costs keep going up, because now these PBMs are financially incented to drive up costs as a percentage of revenue.
Yep. But how does that also fall, from a pricing standpoint? I think I'll start with this. The Medicare, Medicaid being able to negotiate, right? Like on the medical side of the world, like in strict like claims, that at least gives you a baseline of cost.
Yes.
So like you have a relativity. Now you're X percentage higher of Medicare or Medicaid, or you're X percentage lower. So I think like the starting point in having that transparency, if it becomes transparent in like what that pricing they attain is, there's a benefit to that because now we have a floor. At least we have a floor, a negotiated floor that we can benchmark off of. We still don't know the floor. Like that's the other part of it. But that to me is, at least as a starting point, directionally going to allow us far more, ability to determine the appropriate cost we should be paying for drugs. It's a good baseline. But what's the next step in that?
Yeah. So hidden pharmacy concept number 422. Have you ever heard of NADAC before?
No.
So NADAC is this pricing mechanism that's publicly available, part of the federal government. It's a survey-based pricing mechanism that community pharmacies are supposed to take their invoices and submit to NADAC so they know what they paid. And you can use that then as the baseline to start figuring out drug costs in America. NADAC has been pretty loose, though, in the fact that, like, Walgreens doesn't report to NADAC, CVS doesn't report to NADAC. So the biggest purchasers are not reporting into NADAC, and usually it's the smaller guys. So it's probably a little bit of an inflated price off, what the industry's seeing. Two, most people only report generic drugs into NADAC. So you don't get a NADAC price for specialty and brand drugs. And I think, again, from a DC standpoint, a lot of the legislators are saying, so we've kind of got this tool out there in NADAC. It's kind of giving us a little bit of a fair price. Maybe we need to strengthen NADAC, come out with like NADAC version 2.0 and say everybody needs to put all their drugs, specialty brands. So if any retailer wants access to a federal program, Medicare, Medicaid, you have to submit your pricing into NADAC. And I think if we got to that point, that gives us the floor to start kind of understanding where we're at.
Well, I think, all of these migrations of, the vertical integration of PBMs into the carriers and, having like these companies wholly owned by the medical insurers, all of them have been trying to migrate to Medicare.
Yes.
Like that is where the profit center is. It's where the bulk of the population sits. And that has been a very clear delineation where it's the commercial plans, the self-funded plans that we have typically built our careers on are important, but like that's where the importance drives. So like even with some of the acquisitions, like the CVS and acquisition, I think the stat was something like 78% of the Medicare population lives within 3 miles of a CVS. So like when you start thinking of the volume that creates, it's massive. But if they aren't able to access or sell drugs directly to Medicare and Medicaid patients because of, any restrictions that they put on that, that's going to directly hurt their bottom line and what they've been strategically building for the last 5 to 7 years. I mean, again, what I struggle with, though, is how do we have 2 or 3 of the largest pharmacies in the United States not reporting out through this like transparency module? And like, is there a stick behind that, or is it just kind of like no true punishment?
No true punishment. But it's like we brought up the GPOs a little bit ago.
Yeah.
Hundreds of billions of dollars go into these GPOs and it disappears. Nobody knows what happens to it. So that's the pharmacy industry in a nutshell. Nobody knows.
Yeah, and what'd you say last night? It was the PBM. What was the Fortune 10? It was the PBMs. The PBMs sitting at Fortune 10, right?
All of the PBMs are part of healthcare companies that are Fortune 10 companies.
Yeah.
And then you even got the 3 wholesalers. They're all kind of Fortune 12, 13. So the wholesalers and the PBMs and health plans that make them up are really 6 of the 15 largest companies by revenue in America. The largest manufacturer, this was as of 6 months ago, was Johnson & Johnson. And you figure they do more outside of manufacturing too. So, but their entire company was 49th on the Fortune 500 list. So again, everybody thinks pharma is these huge organizations, but when you really compare them on the Fortune 500 list to the companies they're negotiating with, it's not comparable.
So in a perfect world, where do you see this going? Like, how do we transform this? Like, if someone gave you the magic wand tomorrow, how would you change it? And that sounded like an interview question. That wasn't my intent.
Yeah. No. Well, it's funny because even working with policymakers and stuff, they ask. And a lot of times I think if you try to legislate your way out of this problem, it's going to be the law of unintended consequences because these huge companies are brilliant and they're going to find the workaround and they're going to do something to make more money. As much as I hate to say this, there's a law out there, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, that puts a deeper fiduciary responsibility on the plan sponsor and says you have to know if you bring in a consultant or broker, all forms of direct and indirect revenue that they're bringing in. You have this fiduciary responsibility back to the plan members. So if you're making high cost decisions that are driving up plan costs that then increase premiums and deductibles for your members, that's bad. That turns into litigation. So then lawyers are going to start suing these large companies. And as much as I hate that, I think that's what's going to finally get these large self-funded employers to go like, wait a second, let's be honest here. I've spent years saying that my network discounts get better every year. My rebates get bigger every year, but my costs continue to go up every single year. I mean, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. We need to break the cycle. And I think if people start demanding their data, no, like PBM, you've got all the data. I want to see my data. I want to see my costs, which historically they don't see. That's what it's going to take because we don't make purchasing decisions without data and just about any other vendor relationship as a self-funded employer. But for some reason, it's okay in the PBM industry.
What's fascinating to me, though, and I agree with that, and like the litigation piece, in the CAA is, scary in a lot of ways, especially from a medical perspective, on overall claims. It puts an emphasis on like not doing what's easy and making the right changes to benefit the employees and to benefit yourself as the employer and the plan sponsor. But on the pharmacy side of it, like the data is so, like as we talked about before, it's just not available. And so like I have all my claims from any PBM that I'm partnered with flows through our data warehouse. And I get that. And I can look at, percentage of generics. I can look at percentage of specialty, all of those different things. But like once I have the data that shows, they paid X for this drug, like it's very challenging to benchmark. Was that good? Mm-hmm. And you can look at like the rebate improvement in every year. Contracts improve like 1.5% or something like that. And when they say that, it's basically the rebates have improved, which generally means the cost went up because nobody's giving this away. It's not like we'll just pay more and shrink our margins year to year because that's how all of these companies that are in the top 10 would go bankrupt.
Right.
So from an employer standpoint, how should they think of like evaluating that with their consultants? Like where should they look to try and figure out that data to know if they're doing a good job?
Yeah. Well, and one, when we say the rebates improved, you get a bucket of money and they say, here's the rebates you get, plan sponsor. You don't know where that bucket is. And just because that bucket, to your point, got a little bit bigger year over year does not mean that's a good thing. Because again, the upfront costs went up even faster. So your total costs improve. One of the things that we think is really important is we need to get out of this world where we say you get a $2,000 rebate for a specialty drug, but then IPBM get to define what is and is not specialty. So I'll just give you $2,000 on what I feel like, and then I'll keep a bunch of this money over here. I'll give you a 90% discount off some fictitious starting price of a brand or a generic drug. Why aren't we talking about total cost? We don't need to talk about discounts and per claim rebates. We can say, what did you spend last year? Total cost minus rebates plus all admin fees. That's the number we need to be looking at. Yeah. That's the number that matters.
Really looking at the net.
Correct.
Right? Yeah. But, if the total cost is going up and the rebates are increasing, in theory, like they're trying to manage the net through that. But I think, does that manage the same thing in your mind? Or is it, cause, to me, it doesn't. But and I know it doesn't for you as well. But I'd love your thoughts, because you're still managing to a net. It's just, I think the rebates are masking the problem. That's the crack.
It is. It is. And the crack in the system, to your point on the rebates, is most plan sponsors get these rebate revenues back. And it's a significant chunk of money. It's, call it 30% of total pharmacy costs in general, give or take a little bit on either side. But if you're a $10 million a year pharmacy spend and you get $3.5 million back in rebates, and as a benefit leader, that's unbudgeted money.
Yeah. So
now I've got $3.5 million where I can do these other things for my, employees. I can buy Virgin Pulse. I can bring in Livongo. We can do mental health offerings. And I, as a benefit leader, just get to make these decisions. Where if that $3.5 million goes to $2 million, then I have to go to a budget committee and ask budget money to do these other things. They're like, that's really hard. So I get my costs are going up, but my rebates went up, and that gives me more unbudgeted money I can spend on these other things for the population.
Yeah. It's so interesting because, we have talked about this before, but it feels like you just, even as an expert, you kind of get to a place where you're like, this feels like the end of information.
Mm-hmm.
And it's super frustrating. It's like a flat earth. Like if I go any further, I fall off the earth. Like this is where the information flow stops.
Yeah.
And then you hit the curtain and you have no idea what's happening behind the curtain from a baseline standpoint. So from a transparency standpoint, you talked a lot about that in your testimony.
Mm-hmm.
How do you gain the transparency for you guys? How do you work it through Affirm? What are you guys doing to provide transparency to the market? And I think what you guys are doing is unique to the market. So I'd love to hear some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, thanks for the comments, Matt. One, it starts with technology. I do think part of the problem is, and I'm not obviously defending the industry here, but they have chosen to sit on 35-year-old DOS-based technology.
Yeah.
So to pull a lot of stuff out of DOS in a reasonable amount of time is not the easiest thing in the world, but they should be sitting on DOS-based technology at the same time. I mean, it doesn't cost that much for how much money they make to upgrade their tech.
Yeah.
So our first step was to go to cloud-based Windows, rules-driven technology, significantly easier. We can see things in real time. But then second is we're, painfully transparent, as one of our actuaries on the team puts it, because at the end of the day, we could even credential our clients into the adjudication system. So the computer that actually processes all claims, they can watch the claims process and they can see what the pharmacy got paid and that we charged them exactly that amount. We really think it's that, knowledge is power. So let's give all of the data, all the knowledge to the client. I've got nothing to hide then.
Yep. And then in that, during the testimony, you referenced paying the pharmacist and how they get paid. How does the pharmacy get paid? Is it just cost of drugs plus a markup? Or is it
not at all.
Is it that simple? No, right?
No. Most times they get paid the same way self-funded employers are getting charged, is a percentage of AWP, looking at some big bucket. And again, with the PBM sitting in the middle, they want to say, hey, pharmacy, I want to pay you as little as possible. An employer, I want to charge you as much as possible. So they play all these games on brand generic definitions, these other things, especially in the federal programs. There's this concept of DIR fees, direct and indirect remuneration. And so they can just claw back all this money from the community pharmacies. So pharmacies have no idea actually what they're getting paid for their drugs.
Yeah. And it's interesting too because the pharmacies don't know how they're getting paid. The baseline, when I go into a pharmacy, these guys got it together. Mm-hmm. They're just gonna, I need my, amoxicillin. They're gonna hand me, they have it. But I don't think it's mind-boggling to me to think that they're not totally sure what that's gonna cost. And that's gonna vary by plan, right? In formulary and whatever's out there, and by PBM that it's associated with.
Well, it's really how the PBM wants to do what they want to do. And one of my favorite examples is this drug imatinib. So just for perspective, even same plan, same PBM, right? So there's 4 different states. You got Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Louisiana, all with the same PBM. So same PBM, 4 state plans. Mark Cuban can charge $900-ish a year for this oral cancer therapy drug imatinib. Been on the market 30 years. So state of Kentucky, $900 with Cuban. In Kentucky, that's a $26,000 drug a year.
Same exact drug.
Same exact drug. But it gets weirder. Louisiana, with the same PBM, $57,000 a year. Georgia, $170,000 a year. So your poor friends in Atlanta are picking up the tab on this. But then state of Tennessee, $212,000 a year for a drug you can get at Mark Cuban's for $900. But why is the price so different even between those 4 different plans all using the same PBM?
What's driving that in your mind?
All of the different contract language. So probably the $212,000 Tennessee's paying, it's, if you think of the balloon of money that these PBMs play with, they're probably saying, hey, Tennessee, we know you're focused on rebates. So I'll give you a good rebate percentage, and then I'll just make all my profit on the back end by charging you all this cost on these generic drugs. Where maybe in Kentucky, the contract they've signed with Kentucky, and I'm guessing here, right?
Yeah, I understood.
So Kentucky is less focused on rebates. So, they're making a bunch of money on the rebates, so then they can charge less on the upfront. And then because there's all these crazy areas that PBM can point to one specific area to each state to say, no, look, I'm doing a good job on you. Like, look over here, Kentucky, you're not charging a bunch on your drugs. Or look over here, Tennessee, you're getting a ton of rebates. So shiny little toy, but don't look behind the curtain.
Yeah, don't look at the individual numbers. And that's a generic. That blows my mind.
Generic drug.
Because those are, that should be like, a couple $100.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the criminal thing is, if you're on a high deductible or a co-insurance plan with cancer and your state plan is being charged $212,000, and you got to pick up a percentage of that, you can't afford it. Like, that's why we have problems with healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just speaks to why people don't get care. Because the fear of like what I'm going to be charged and not knowing what it's the only thing we buy like that. And I've said this on this podcast and in life constantly, is that this is the only thing we purchase where we have no clue and no buying decision. Like, we don't buy cars like this. We don't buy anything where we're just like, seems right.
Yeah.
Okay, this is what you're charging me. No problem. Like, I'll pay that. So in those scenarios, how do you attack that? Like, how would you attack that? Where you just look at it and say, imatinib is what it's called, right? We're going to do this the right way, and you're charging just a fee, right? Like,
correct.
So walk me through like your pricing structure, because that's where this is very different.
Yeah, thank you. So again, when we came to market, we really were intentional to say, how do we not create conflict in what we're trying to do against our clients? And again, when you make a percentage of revenue and then, you want to drive up your revenue to make your profits, those are all the problems. So we said, let's just get paid a per claim admin fee. So depending on the size of our client, it's between $6 and $7. So that's kind of the range. So in that previous example where there's a $5,000 drug you could use or a $50 drug, I financially don't care, right? I'm going to make my $6 or $7 either way, no matter which one I approve. But sometimes you need the $5,000 drug, but more often than not, you probably don't. Yep. So, and that's those delinking bills that Congress is trying to think through. That's what they're trying to say too, is like, hey, if everybody just gets paid this flat admin fee, then they're not going to be incented to drive up the costs.
Yep.
And so that's how we build it from the beginning.
And the good news for anybody in the PBM space, right? Like, there's a tremendous amount of volume associated with Americans in the medicines that they're taking. Yeah. We aren't as healthy as we should be, right? So like there's always money to be made in this. And I don't think anybody argues that it shouldn't be. I think from a PBM perspective, you still need the PBMs to kind of go to the market and procure everything and bring that to the pharmacies, I believe. Like, I don't think every pharmacy would be able to reach all of the different big pharma companies. So I think you need that middleman. But I think like in doing it in a fee structure, it allows you to do that. What would you say to someone who says like, well, $7 feels like a lot? Like like knowing what the imatinib example kind of speaks to the other side of it, where like it would save a tremendous amount of, like, wouldn't you rather spend $7 on that script plus, whatever the cost of the drug is? Mm-hmm. Versus that. But like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's this is a great question. I guess it was like 6 weeks ago, this exact problem came up because we're lifting out from a traditional PBM to us. The traditional PBM was charging a 12 cents per claim admin fee, 12 cents. Mm. And so we win the business and we're $7. And at some point in time, one of the leaders of this organization says like, well, who made this decision, right? Like, why in the world would we want to pay $7 versus 12 cents? And we went back to him and said, well, here's why. Because we took all your claims data, and this group was spending, call it $1 million a month. So every month, $1 million, but you're only paying your 12-cent admin fee. With us, because I'm going to show you exactly what I'm paying for the drugs, and I don't have any extra markup, you're going to pay $600,000. Now, you're going to pay a $7 admin fee. So do you want to pay $1 million with 12 cents? Or do you want to pay $600,000 with $7 on the back end? And I think even that $7 on the back end, when you added it all up, it was like maybe like $23,000 a month. Yeah. So yes, it's $23,000 a month in our admin fee, but with the technology that we do, the data's not cheap to store and push out to everybody. Having people to build formularies, the right way, pharmacists, all of these things, like it costs money to do business.
And they're netting between $4 and $5 million in annual savings, plan savings, right? Like
correct.
$380,000 a month on a net basis just by gaining that transparency.
Yeah. And so once we showed the math to the person, they were like, well, why were we paying $1 million? Exactly. That's the question you would ask, not the 12 cents.
Well, I think it's the inertia is one of the biggest challenges we face. And it's not just in the PBM space, but it's like migrating people from fully insured to self-funded, where in the fully insured environment, they're getting creamed. And like we had a gentleman we used to work with who oversaw public and labor, and he used to talk about profitless trend. And people are like, that's made up. Retrospectively, he was 20 years ahead of the curve. Because he was talking about like take all of like the rebates out of it, all the nods, like what's our real number? Like what does that look like? And so, but I think that inertia is like the killer because it's changed. Now I have to explain who AffirmedRX is as opposed to like who CVS is. But you guys are, for the most part, pharmacy agnostic, right?
Completely.
You don't care where someone goes, and that's almost like almost like the elimination of the network, which I think to some degree is coming on the medical side. Like I think. Because of the way the structures, I think, like, in conversations I've had, people have said, we believe, like, at some point the carriers, if we start carving out too much, they're just going to be like, well, we'll just charge you more to carve out. And at some point, like, the next step in that is going to be like, we have to figure out a way to not use their network.
Exactly.
And like, I think, like, not just on the PBM side, like, on everything. But I think that inertia is because of the cost. Like, you know, if you look at, like, the 20-year growth, I think we have a slide that we've presented off. It's like 345%. Since 2000 has been the increase in medical care. I just wrestle with like, you know, how quickly we can get people there. And like, for one is like, how quickly can we get the population off like fully insured? Because that is a true profit for the carriers. Then how can we migrate them into self-funded? And I think helping them understand how simple it is for a PBM to be carved out and what that looks like. So from a lift standpoint, how would you define like what that looks like for somebody when you carve out the PBM? You know, what does that feel like for somebody? What would the experience change for the member, if anything?
It really shouldn't change much for the member. And I think there's a couple things that people forget when they talk about transitioning from one PBM to the next. First, usually the first PBM you have is on DOS. And everybody lives in this world where they're like, oh man, the implementation went bad. You know, so we moved from, you know, our old PBM to our new PBM on January 2nd, like no claims processor was terrible. Well, that's DOS. You know, Windows-based technology makes it about 90% easier to build a plan. So once you get the plan built, then you just take an eligibility file. And whether there's 1 million people on this eligibility file or 100, it's really no more work for us, right? Because this is all just software on the back end processing claims. And they can process millions of claims a second. It's just really not that hard. So if you use a technology advanced PBM, there's not much of a problem with it. But then even the formulary is the next big thing everybody always is worried about. Well, I've got this formulary today with my PBM. Well, if I move to you, you're going to have a different formulary. If you stay with your PBM, you're going to have a different formulary next year anyhow, because they're always changing their formularies. Yeah. So whether you stay or whether you move, it's almost the exact same experience.
I would agree with that. And, you know, like those things that are shifting within that formulary, going from brand to generic, generic to brand to specialty. What do you see as a change in the industry as far as like the injectables? Because that, like, one thing from a profit center for the hospitals, you know, when you start going into the hospital versus being treated at home. Yeah. But is that another area where you think like the PBM can make an impact? Or is that a longer term situation?
Well, again, can they make an impact for the good in that case? Likely. But, you know, in the medical space, we spend a lot of time talking about brown bagging, white bagging, clear bagging. So like if I've got cancer and I need one of these injectable products, does it come from the hospital, which probably owns the oncology practice? Does it come from the PBM who mails it to me? Or, you know, does it come from the practice maybe themselves, right? Yeah. And everybody's talking about like who should own that process. And I got to admit, I'm agnostic to that because I think the argument's just who wants the money. Nobody's really trying to say this process is typically better for the member. Now, I do think some oncology practices should be the ones doing it because at the end of the day, you could show up today and maybe you need 5 milligram dose as opposed to the 4 that the PBM sent. Well, now you can't get your therapy. Yep. So I think the way that we have drugs fulfilled closest to the point of care, where that point of care could be changing, that should be the right answer. And then if you've got a problem with that cost, then legislate off of that. But don't allow all these other people to do things just because they want to grab the revenue.
And the white bagging is going to someone's house, right?
Correct.
And what's brown bagging? That was the other one?
So brown bagging is like when you carry it in. So like if the hospital owns the practice, then the hospital gives it.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. So it's still coming in from the hospital. And there's a little bit more flexibility there.
What's clear bagging?
So clear bagging then is when the practice does it itself.
Gotcha.
So that is as close as you can get.
Okay. That's interesting because we've talked a lot about like, the better experience for the member. Because, for me, it's also like, do we keep someone out of there?
Yes.
Like keep someone out of going to the hospital and go home. And, we've even had people talk to us about like doing injections themselves. And that doesn't seem real. I mean, I wouldn't want to do it.
I don't want to do it. Yeah.
No, so that doesn't seem like a real thing. So one of the things I wanted to ask, because I took some notes on your call, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you like one or two of these questions.
Oh, man.
But this is from a panel you did recently, specifically around like the Blue Shield of California transition, where they're essentially eliminating CVS Caremark as their PBM and they're breaking it into, I believe, 5 components across 5 different vendors. Do you see that as a real solution long term? Because it feels like it's a lot of moving parts to manage.
Do I have to answer that?
You don't have to. You can do it in as a political way as you would like, or we don't have to answer it at all.
No,
we can edit this whole thing out.
Yeah, no, I'm kind of kidding. I commend Blue Shield for taking this step. I mean, they're a huge plan. They know what they're doing is broken. They know they've got to try something different. So good for them. The solution they landed on, like I'm kind of terrified for it. They're bringing in kind of a back-end technology, may or may not be great. Then they're saying, hey, Amazon, Cuban's pharmacy, these other pharmacies, we're going to, dispense through you. Well, how do you figure out what goes to Amazon, what goes to Cuban? So there's just so many moving parts to your point of this. And then layer in CVS is still keeping specialty, which is over 50% of their spend. Yep. So what games are going to be allowed to be played there? So I think they saw a problem. It's so complex that even a huge organization like Blue Shield California didn't come up with a specific solve for it. So they just want to try something. I hope it works for them, but my biggest fear is it doesn't do what they hoped. And then the rest of the market's going to go like, oh, look, Blue Shield couldn't do it. They tried it. They just went back to the traditional model. I guess I just need to stay here too.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm most worried about is that if and kind of when it's not what they were hoping for, does that actually hurt everybody else trying to do something unique?
Yeah. And it's interesting. It's kind of like that Amazon, JP Morgan, when they try to like for healthcare, it's like, oh yeah, we didn't work. We're just going to go back to the usual. And everyone's like, see?
Yep.
And I think it reinforced something that, while I think it was going to be hard to get to a solution, I think they could have got to a better outcome. And so I think that's one of those things where I agree with you. But, I am with you in the commending of Blue Shield to try it.
Yes.
Like to have the gumption to do it and to have the willingness to like at least try and figure out, is there a better way? And it could fail, but at least they're taking a shot because what's happening, and I think the projection was like $500 million in savings.
Yes.
Which they're going to pass on to the plan, and we'll see, if that comes to fruition fully or even partially. But that's a big number when you're talking about, I think the trend this year they're saying for 2024 is 7%. We've seen it slightly lower in our book, but like that's a big number, and 7% on their block of business is massive.
Yep,
fully insured or otherwise. So eating that cost would not be something that I would want. One other question that had come up. This was actually during your testimony, which was around spread pricing, and we didn't. It actually there was a lot of questions about it. You offered clarity to it, but I would love to talk about that a little bit, just what it is, right? Because most people have heard about it at this point, but everyone's like, I still don't get it. Charging less, charging more. What does that look like? So can we just walk through that a little bit too?
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with the PBM is the middleman, and everybody talks about them being in the middle, but they truly are in the middle. And what happens, you've got a self-funded employer. They need to offer pharmacy benefits for their employees. Well, they can't go contract with all these different pharmacies. So that's why they hire a PBM to say, hey, tell me what drugs we can use, contract with a manufacturer, contract with a pharmacy. I just logistically can't do it. Then on the pharmacy side, well, the pharmacy likes the PBM sitting in the middle because they need people to come in and, bring their drugs so they can get revenue, and they can't contract with those thousands of employers. Mm-hmm. So the PBM does a good function to say, okay, I'll tie these employers into a contract. I'll tie these pharmacies into a contract, and I'll make it easy. Yep. And 30 years ago, it was great. They were doing a really good service, but then they started sitting in the middle saying, well, hey, look, I PBM sit in the middle. I pay the pharmacy. They only know what they got paid. They don't know what I charge the employer. And when I charge the employer, they don't really know what I paid the pharmacy. So they started to exploit that into this concept of spread pricing. So your amoxicillin example.
Yeah.
You would walk into the pharmacy with your amoxicillin prescription and say you got a $5 copay, pharmacy gets paid $10.
Yep.
So the pharmacy took $15 total for that amoxicillin prescription. Then they would bill your plan $25. Well, the plan doesn't know that $15 went out the door to pay the pharmacy for it, so they can create $10 in spread pricing, which is just pure profit.
And that's been going on for how long? Has that been like
years.
Since like that's not a new thing, right?
Not a new thing.
So that's been going on for years. And that has, I assume, like that margin has only increased, right?
Correct.
So on top of that, like when you talk about the rebates, that doesn't come out of the spread,
No.
right? The rebates is just off the cost of the drug. One of the things that I always find interesting is like, you know, when I was on the carrier side and when as a consultant, you know, the 100% rebate reimbursement, I find it hard to know like what is really 100%. Like, are we getting the whole thing?
Oh, my contention is you're getting 100% of the rebates. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's what's defined as a rebate. So, because really what happens on the rebate side is if we think 10 years ago, if a manufacturer was given a PBM $1,000 in total revenue,
Yep.
900 of that would have been called a rebate, and 100 of that would have been these admin fees, right?
Yep.
And so, you know, 8, 9 years ago, then these PBMs started saying, well, if I get $900 back in rebates, I'm not going to give all $900 to the client, so I'll keep a little bit of it. And then everybody started saying, whoa, like you should be passing 100% of rebates to the clients. Well, in the evil genius world of these PBMs, they're like, oh, okay, I'll figure this is easy. Okay, I'll give you 100% of rebates.
Yeah.
So now as we sit here today, if that pharma company's given the PBM now through a GPO, two of which, as you pointed out, are international, but as they give that $1,000, now they're saying, fine, call 600 of it a rebate. Client, here's the $600. I gave you 100% of the rebates, but I have 22 fees in the background that account for the other 400.
Yeah.
So they can just keep gobbling up more and more of the money, but pass 100% of the rebates through.
Yeah. Mind-boggling.
It is.
It's funny because I feel like we're just scratching the surface on all this stuff, and we've been talking for 35 minutes, right? And
Yes.
like you're sitting here, and you're like, "There's just so much more." One question that came up, it was actually asked to the doctor. I believe it was Dr. Dwayne who was sitting next to you, and they asked her about, you know, could she prescribe drugs? And one of the things that she said, like, was, you know, there's certain drugs that like she gets overridden on. And the doctor should own, like, we should prescribe what we feel. And something I feel strongly is, like, it's impossible for every doctor to know all the options. And then align to the formulary. And the formulary is a necessary evil because it does control cost. But it feels to me that everybody's grabbing for, like, control of this process. And there's no check and balance on any side of it. Like, the carriers want it from an expense standpoint. Mm-hmm. They also want to own the profits that are running through from the GPOs and, like, how drugs are distributed. Then there's the PBMs making money, like, as we've talked about. And then there's, like, the doctors are like, we want control back, but, like, they need the check and balance as well. So do the hospitals. So is there a scenario where, because in theory, like, if I think this is all working in concert, like, they should all be a check and balance on each other, right? Like, the PBM should be looking at, like, well, the doctor prescribed this. They have no idea what's on the formulary. And so we're going to correct it to this medication, which is, like, biosimilar or falls into that same bucket. But that's not happening today. Do you believe we get there through the legislation that they're talking about?
No, probably not. But I think the example you gave is such an important one because doctors get about 8 weeks worth of pharmacotherapy education. So in all of their medical school training, they get 8 weeks of drugs. That's it.
Yep.
Right. Pharmacists have years of training in drugs. So I'm not saying that, you know, pharmacists should be making the decisions, but I think doctors have gotten so frustrated, especially over the last couple of years, because they see arbitrary decisions being made in the formulary. And those arbitrary decisions are, I make more money on this drug, so I'll pick this drug to be on formulary. So to your point, if we lived in this world where we were making clinical decisions and not financial decisions on formularies, and which is what we do. So when we call a physician and say, hey, you wrote this prescription, we're not going to cover it. Here's why. Here's what the options are. But at the same time, you have a path to coverage anytime, as we call it. So if that doctor says, no, I hear you saying we've got these 3 things, but here's what's specifically going on with my patient, why I think they need this drug, well, you can still get it approved. And to our knowledge, we're one of the only PBMs who puts clinicians out there to call and have that conversation with the doctor. Because when you have a candid conversation with the doctor, they're like, this is great. Thanks. We appreciate it. They don't get mad.
No, and I could see that because they're getting consulted and you're still giving them optionality.
Exactly.
They're still having – that's their check and balance in the process where they're saying like this isn't covered. But – and what's the path to coverage look like?
It's they can fill out a form at any point in time. And again, we send them the form and say, okay, so it's a terrible example. First thing that comes out of my head, we cover Eli Lilly insulin and not Novo. There's like maybe the occasional place where there's a diabetic who is allergic to one of the inner, just kind of filler ingredients in their insulin, and Lilly, they can't take it. So the doctor would just say, hey, we've tried this. They have an allergic reaction. They have to take this other product because that's the only one they can take. Okay, cool. We'll cover that then.
Yep. And do you cover that as the same price? Is that covered as like a like a brand, or how does that go?
So that it would be the same price.
Yep.
The big difference on the back end net cost, though, is depending on where we are, but in this case, we probably wouldn't. I wouldn't have a rebate contract with Novo.
Yep.
So the plan sponsor wouldn't get rebate dollars for that, but their member is hopefully staying on their insulin and not ending up in the hospital and having a lot more medical costs. But, that would be a little bit of the trade-off.
So let me ask you this, because one of the other questions was around like step therapy, and you kind of alluded to that where like we've tried this, it didn't work because of the allergen, and so we are on this one, and they have the path to coverage. Do you think there's a world where we start getting into like really utilizing like pharmacogenomics and trying to figure out like true solubility of a specific drug in somebody's body and like get away from all this BS and be like, this is what this person needs to take because this is what works with their genetics?
Oh, I love that question. I hope so. Pharmacogenomics has a ton of potential. 5 years ago, though, these pharmacogenomic tests were about $2,500 each. So a lot of people are like, that's just too much. Well, as we say here today, it's a couple $100. Yeah. And, 10 years from now, it's going to be even less. And the really interesting thing to me, again, geeky pharmacist, I guess, a little bit, around pharmacogenomics is it's really not that important for diabetic medications, hypertensive medications, high cholesterol medications. It's more important on mental health medications. And so when you really kind of think about the standard of care, if you're diabetic and your blood sugars are 150, which is high, I can, do a finger prick on you and figure out exactly what your blood sugar is and if that drug is working in you.
Yep.
Well, these mental health medications, if you're depressed and we give you an antidepressive medication and we say, hey, take this in 4 weeks, you'll start kind of feeling something one way or the other. Then you come back and I say, how you feeling, Matt? You're like, maybe I'm less depressed, right? Like there's just no
Fantastic.
test you can take on that. But those are the drugs that are most susceptible to when you think about your liver and your kidneys. So when you put a pill in your mouth, right, it goes through the stomach, it gets into the body, and then your liver and kidneys start chewing it up. Well, they chew up those drugs either faster or slower, more so than any other drug. So a pharmacogenomics test, I could give it to you and I could see that your liver chews up these drugs really, really fast. So if I give you a standard dose of the drug, it's never going to work.
Yeah.
So that really then gives us the ability to understand which drug and which strength we need to give people in probably one of the most critical disease states we're dealing with in America today.
Yeah. And the mental health is just, I mean, we're just, scratching the surface on like what's underneath the hood. And I think it's one of those, the pharmacogenomics specifically has been something that's come up, and it just, to me, like when you hear a doctor say like we should control that, but like what they should control is like testing for that.
Yes.
Especially in those types and it's definitely not happening on a mental health front like that. And I believe there's also cancer drugs that it's really relevant to as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got to say, but in the cancer field, we know like if you've got this one gene, this drug's going to work with you. Like that's working well. Like I think that's very clear. It's more on, kind of the general primary care piece where I think pharmacogenomics is still hidden. I'm
excited to see where that goes. And I think that's going to help at least like improve care. I don't know if it truly controls costs depending on the drugs that we're driving them to based on need, but I think it is going to improve care at the very least and like help accelerate people to a more stable place.
Well, but even on that control cost. So say we give you a pharmacogenomic test and the generic drugs don't work for you.
Yep.
So we've got to give you a higher cost brand drug. We could think that's a higher cost in a silo, but if we wouldn't have done the test and you would have taken the generic drugs, that's 7 or 8 physician visits. You're going to keep going back to the doctor saying, well, you gave me this drug, I still feel not great. You gave me this drug, I still don't feel great. So how much cost went into that before maybe then you actually end up on that higher cost drug that actually does work for you?
And the claim mitigation is the hardest part to prove.
Exactly.
That's like, I think that is a driver across all of healthcare where it's like, what did we avoid?
Yeah.
Because it's unprovable. Like what didn't happen, like nobody knows. But at the same time, there's real cost to that. And so driving people away from that is valuable. And so my last question is, as tempting as it is to end on pharmacogenomics, I would love to talk about like the guarantees. Like, so one of the things that I've loved about working with AffirmedRX is that you guys will come in and say like, we'll guarantee you savings. We will guarantee you 10% savings. And I just want to kind of close on that because I think that is unique. And I think as we start talking about with our clients and we talk with prospects, that's one of the things I'm talking about, like total cost guarantees. Like, let's look at this instead of like these retrospective rebate guarantees and really working off of a net. But I just want to like close on your thoughts on like how you're guaranteeing, what that looks like, because I think it's important for people who made it to the end of this with us to really understand what that is.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. So again, when we came into this whole company and how do we change the industry for the better, one of the biggest problems is how we price in the industry. And again, nobody's buying a vendor agreement off of total cost for a PBM standpoint. And we said, like, again, this is madness, right? Money in and out of the bank is what matters. So the best way we've found so far, and I'm not saying we're right or we're going to, meet the needs of a bunch of employers, but we're trying to go to them to say like, hey, time out. I mean, I can make up some discount and I can make up some rebate and then I'll just sign some contract language that, plays games with all this stuff and your costs are still going to go up. What really matters and what drives your premium decisions next year and how you look at like whether you increase copays or other things is how much you spend. Yeah. So let's focus on the spend. And because we know your spend goes up every year because of these bad industry practices, and we don't do all those industry practices, we don't have all the fat, we're not trying to make a bunch of profit like everybody else, we absolutely know we can save 10%. And by the way, we're only guaranteeing 10%. Most of our clients are going to save 20, 25, 30%. And we want to be real clear. We're not then on the back end saying like, ooh, I get half of that in some shared savings model. Yeah. No, like all of the savings should go back to the plan. That's
You're basically saying your worst case scenario is 10% savings.
Correct.
Right? Like we expect to do better. We'll guarantee 10. We expect more.
Yep. And we take a very, I think, hard stance on this. It was funny. I'm naive some days and I just very Pollyannish that the world's great and wonderful and, people are out to do good. So we know there's some other companies out there talking about these savings guarantees. And so as we've talked to consultants, they really start pushing to say, well, okay, so you're guaranteeing 10% savings, but what happens if you don't miss it? And in my world, I'm like, well, I pay you back the money, right? Like, so if I guaranteed you $1 million in savings and you only got 500,000, I'm going to give you 500,000. That was my guarantee. And they're like, oh, what other companies say is if they don't save the 10%, they'll give you a percentage of your admin fee back. And I'm like, oh, like I'd never even considered that. Like, no, I mean, put your money where your mouth is, do the right thing and get a better outcome.
Yeah. I love that. I think we did it. This was
it.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you making the time to do this and wish you a safe flight home.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah. This was fun. I appreciate the invite.
Great to see you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Get more out of your benefits when you connect with Genesis Health on LinkedIn or through our website, www.genesis.health. And be sure to subscribe to the Benefit Summary wherever you get your podcasts. That way you don't miss the benefit of future episodes. This has been the Benefit Summary, presented by your friends at Genesis Health.